Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome you to the On-Farm Solar PV Training Webinar Series brought to you by Maryland Energy Extension Program. As we're waiting for others to join this afternoon, I'll start with an introduction. My name is Drew Cheval, and I'm an energy specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. And if you're not familiar with the Extension program with the university, in some ways, it is a front door to the university connecting to the public. Every land-grant university has one of those. And so I know we have some joining us from other states as well. But what we do is kind of connect the public with the research and educational priorities that we have at the University of Maryland. And we deliver educational programs much like we're running today on the on-farm solar PV. So, you know, I'll mention a couple things about the series. I know we have a lot of folks that are rejoining and have participated in previous sessions as well. I also see a lot of new folks joining today's session. We've touched on a number of interesting topics to date. The list is on our website, the Maryland Energy Extension website. The recordings and educational materials are posted there if you wanted to review any of those. Our session today will also be posted there as well. So you'll probably be familiar with the website through the registration process for this session. Now, before we get started on the program for today, I think it'd be worth mentioning just some of the, since we do have a lot of newer individuals joining our session today, just kind of revisiting the purpose of this program. Primarily, this webinar series is directed towards on-farm energy use. And so we have a lot of farmers, ag service providers, policymakers, and others interested and faced with decision-making regarding on-farm energy use and solar PV. We've talked about small scale systems, but next week in particular, I'll just mention we're going to shift gears a little bit towards utility scale solar PV. So it'll be a little bit different next week. We'll be joined by our legal specialist, Paul Geringer, diving into more utility scale leasing issues. But today, to kind of continue this trend of the series, we're looking at on-farm energy use. And we're going to kind of look at it from a different angle. We've touched on the design aspects, the sizing of the systems, the financing, I think, was last week, and we looked at different grants, loans, and other things. So we've looked at it from a technical, economical, and even from a policy and zoning framework previously. So again, go back and revisit any of those previous sessions if you're interested in learning more. But today, as you see, the topic is community solar and solar co-ops. We're going to focus, there is distinction between those. We're going to focus mostly in that community solar category, and looking at shared solar is another way that you'll hear it expressed. I'll probably stick with shared solar convention throughout the webinar today, but you'll hear those words kind of used interchangeably. It really depends on who you ask. You'll get different definitions, but we'll kind of dive into what these terms mean. But it's the topic today really, I think, poses a lot of opportunities for continued solar development across the state for not only our agricultural users that are interested in this, but residential and other businesses as well. So it'll be kind of an interesting conversation to have. We have an hour for the program today, and I'll try to wrap up a little bit earlier than I usually do and leave time for questions at the end. But let me just give a couple notes here as we get started. Again, this is being recorded. The posting will be up later this week on our website. If you have questions, put them into the Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to kind of address those as we go forward. And I'll try to keep my eye on it throughout the session today, but get those questions in, and I'll at least address those at the end of our session. Before we get into kind of looking at the specifics of what shared solar is, community solar, and the like, I'm going to launch the first survey just so I have an idea of who's joining the session today. I recognize some names, but I know we have some new faces, as I mentioned. I guess I can't say faces because we're still doing online training, but new names, I guess. So take a minute and just indicate on the survey that appears on your screen, industry that you're joining us from. I know we've had a number of folks in academic realm, ag service providers and farmers join in the past. But please take a minute to answer those 3 questions and then click the submit button. And so a lot of the information that you're getting into the survey here will help as we kind of leverage this online program into our programming next year. Fingers crossed that we'll do more hands-on training, and I believe that is the plan, pending any changes and restrictions, but we'll do more hands-on training with solar photovoltaic equipment and gain some experience in that sector, but this will be helpful for that. So I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll now. I've got most responses in. So thank you for that. And now we'll shift and look a little bit about what we'll be touching on today. So first, we're going to talk about what it is, what shared solar is, or community solar, if you want to call it that. We'll look at some of the benefits to it and how it works and why it's applicable, and we'll start to get an idea of how we could move forward with it. Later in the session, we'll look at the availability of it across the country, specifically the program in Maryland, the pilot program, and then some of the steps that we can take to get started on it. So, as I mentioned, community or shared solar presents some really unique opportunities, which is very applicable to sites that have restricted access or availability to solar photovoltaics. So we've seen a lot of market growth in that side. And I'll talk about it first from kind of physical limitations. When you're considering a solar photovoltaic installation on your property, you're either going to do a rooftop system or a ground mount system. You get more flexibility, as we've talked in the past about ground mounting in terms of being able to face it directly south to get the right tilt angle on it. If it's on the roof, you're kind of limited there. So there are some restrictions, and in some cases, you don't have the available space. Either your roof is not big enough and you've got the fire codes to worry about and other issues like that. You might not have a large enough land area, or it may be a shaded area. For whatever reason, there may be some restrictions. And again, we've kind of talked about a lot of these topics previously, so I'm not gonna get too much into that, but for various physical restrictions, there's some limitations there as well. And so I've kind of touched on that. You might have an unsuitable site. It could be a land issue. It could be that your roof is north facing. It could be that a number of issues. The cost of the systems also, you're talking about the upfront investment cost of solar PV, or any renewable for that matter, is pretty high. And so that's something else that has to be offset in a typical installation of a PV system. We did talk about ways that we could offset that cost last week. We looked at the tax credit, the federal tax credit, depreciation for commercial operations that farmers can take advantage of. We talked about grants and loans, but still there is some investment cost with it. And of course, as we pivot more towards talking about shared or community solar, we'll see a benefit there as we're avoiding that upfront cost in a lot of applications. If we're just subscribing to one of those systems, then we don't have that investment cost either. And then there's also the issue of ownership, and particularly relevant for people renting property or homes, apartments, or anything like that. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about that. It's more of a residential aspect, but there is some overlap there. And I have heard from a lot of folks that are concerned about installing a PV system if they're just renting the property. They don't have that option, or even if they're relocating, planning on relocating, they might sell that property or something like that, and they may not want to invest in that technology at that point. So there's some ownership issues as well. And I'm not going to spend too much more time talking about these areas. We've mentioned many of those previously, but I want to shift gears now and talk about what shared solar or community solar actually entails. And As I said, you get different definitions depending on who you ask, but I'll kind of highlight some of the general aspects of it so we understand what's involved. But usually what I'm going to be talking about in terms of shared or community solar is when you have an off-site installation. So the PV system is not installed on the site. It could be from any of those reasons I mentioned a minute ago. But really, it's a billing mechanism where multiple subscribers can participate in that and buy into the energy system. We'll look at different ways that takes place. But this allows one single PV system to service multiple entities. And typically, you'll get credited on your utility bill. And I'll mention it's a local site. We're not talking about green programs where it has to be on your utility grid. The electricity is being sent onto the electricity grid with the utility transmission and distribution network. So it's all local within your city jurisdiction or service area. So it's not a green program or anything like that. We'll kind of touch on what that is, but this PV is going to be installed on what's commonly called a host site, and it could be your own property, and that's one way that you could get involved with shared solar. Whether for financial reasons or investment reasons, you could be a host site for shared solar. It could be on a business farm or any other entity. I've indicated some examples here on the slide deck, but that gives you an idea of kind of where it could be installed, and we'll get more details later. I do kind of want to emphasize the difference before we get too far in all the different definitions that often get thrown around. So again, just to reiterate once more, I'm talking primarily about off-site, or what I'll call shared or community solar. There's similar examples, like in the figure I'm sharing with you. This is an on-site system, and there are a lot of similarities with an on-site system like this. This in this example, or this illustration, is on an apartment complex or something like that. And so it is distributed to multiple users within that apartment complex. So yeah, there are similarities, but what I'm primarily talking about is this offsite where it's installed elsewhere in your local area. And then that energy, that electricity, the electrons actually flow onto the grid, and you have this billing mechanism that credits that amount to your main utility provider, whether that's Pepco or BG&E or any of the other providers. Again, you will see some on-site opportunities available in the state of Maryland and other states as well, but we're primarily talking about that off-site. So a couple points here that I'll just mention about subscribers, and that's how many of us will probably participate in a shared solar program is as a subscriber. And so I'll just mention you're tied to a specific unit. So it's not like a green program. Well, maybe with green programs, you still have an idea of where that renewable energy is being generated. But this is a local specific project that you say, my electricity is coming from that site. Now, it's hard to track the actual electrons flowing through the wires, but for the most part, you're saying my electricity comes from that specific site installed at, the host site. And you can name a specific name for that. And you share some of that electrical output. And again, benefit there is that you're getting that renewable PV energy source, but the amount is per kilowatt hour is credited to your billing account. And we'll look at the economics of that a little bit later. So looking at different business models, again, just to reiterate, we're talking about shared or community solar. That's the brunt of the program today is looking at it at this shared or community solar program. So the electricity is shared by more than one home or business. And this can come in one or two ways. It could be an ownership model or a subscription model, two different ways that it comes. And so we'll kind of talk about both of these, ownership and subscription model. The ownership model is where, as a subscriber, you purchase a number of panels, or it could be kilowatt blocks of the system. So you're really buying the capacity of the system. So this example here just gives, different businesses essentially owning or financing a set power of the system. And so, yeah, this is kind of conceptual, but the idea is that you're buying into the power rating of the system or the capacity of the system. The other form that this comes, and we'll talk more about this, the subscription model is based on the energy output, the kilowatt hour rating of the system. And so again, a lot of details provided here, but we'll kind of dive into these two models a lot through the course of our webinar today, is looking at the ownership model and the subscription model. So the ownership is more in line with owning a set kilowatt capacity, whereas the subscription is more of the amount of energy that's being generated by the site. Now, two other systems that are commonly confused or are kind of the terms used interchangeably are the solar co-op and the green power programs. And I'll just briefly mention a note about these, but we're really not going to focus on these too much today. It's a little outside the scope of what we can address in one session. A solar co-op, just like any co-op that you might be familiar with, a food co-op or anything like that, it's a community-driven project. You typically prepay or buy into the program and receive the benefits there. The key distinction that I want to make kind of in the way that it's defined here is a solar co-op is where it's on-site installation. And so you see a number of sites here, each with its own installation. So individual homes or businesses can install the solar PV, but it's a negotiation price negotiation going in with this co-op to decide on installers and other aspects as well. So beyond this, I'm not going to spend too much more time talking about the co-op. We're going to be talking more, like I said, that off-site shared solar. Green programs I mentioned a minute ago, but you know this is also not quite shared solar. It's pretty closely related, but with this type of program, you're typically just exchanging the renewable energy credits, the RECs, or in the case of solar, it'd be an SREC. But you're typically just trading the certificate, and there's a lot of retailers that delve into this, but this could be from any renewable energy source, does not have to be from within your local area or service area, could even be from outside the state within your distribution network. But you know, this is a little beyond what we'll talk about today, and it's not tied to a specific project. So again, we're going to be talking about the community options, primarily ownership and subscription models. So to define a couple key terms, we've used, you know, the first term here, subscriber. I've used that a number of times already. But that's how, as I said, many of us will probably relate to the system by buying into it or subscribing. Whatever model you go with, the ownership or the subscription model, you'll typically invest in it as a subscriber and own some of the benefits or the credits of the system that get written off on your utility. An anchor tenant is just someone that takes more greater portion of that energy, typically up to about 40%. The sponsor or operator is somebody that oversees the whole program and project, could be involved with the solar installer or an SPE, and we'll talk about some of these specifics, but this is a very basic diagram, both of these diagrams indicating kind of the same concept. And depending on the way that the program is structured, and there's many options out there, this can get more sophisticated, but keeping it simple right now, the sponsor or the operator oversees the system, could be involved with the installation as well. And then you have that third party, or let me not use that terminology, but you have the utility provider, and they're going to be responsible for the distribution and transmission of that electricity. And so again, if you're getting your power from a PV system, you're offsetting some of your energy use. And so you're typically not going to get 100% of your energy from a solar, a shared solar program. You can offset your energy. Maybe even if you have a PV system already on your rooftop or ground mount, you could supplement that energy with one of these programs. But if you're getting the energy from a PV system, a shared solar system, your utility provider is going to credit you for whatever you're using. And in Maryland, that's on a kilowatt hour basis, 1-to-1. So there are a number of benefits to these programs, and I'll just kind of briefly mention a few, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. Biggest category here is, you know, a market expansion. And so I mentioned, you know, a lot of folks in the state of Maryland and in other states as well have limited access. Maybe it's economical, or maybe it's rooftop availability or those kind of aspects, but this creates a lot of potential for other participants to join in solar PV and renewable energy. So there's a lot of equity there. There's I'll mention specifically when we talk about the Maryland pilot program is availability of low and moderate income opportunities as well. There's some carve outs for that. But the availability, again, overcoming financial and physical barriers, mobility is something we'll mention as well. And what I mean by this is oftentimes you don't want to be tied to that piece of property, or you may have plans to relocate and move. And oftentimes you can carry that with you, especially if you stay within the utility area. That's typically no problem to transfer that over to a new residence, because the PV system's not actually installed. You don't have to disassemble it and reassemble it or anything like that. And so there are some benefits there. The economic side as well, and of course, the larger the system is, there's really no minimum for Maryland on how small you can go. There are maximum capacities, size systems you can build, but typically the larger you are, the more economical. Again, the ease as well, I just want to point out, and again, I'm not trying to take the role of a salesman here. You know, really this is kind of to deliver, you know, decision-based, you know, decision-making tools to you guys. But I'll mention, you know, some of the aspects here. Like I said, it is easy because you don't have to worry about installing the system on your site. If you're just getting involved as a subscriber, you don't have to install the system. You don't have to work on the permitting or any of that. So that's kind of, now if you're developing your own program, you'll probably be more involved, and it may not be as easy as I'm making it out to be here, but there are some benefits in terms of just subscribing to an existing program. And then, of course, it being a local program, and especially comparing to a green energy program or something like that, this is a local system where you can see the physical system in your area. So a lot of benefits to it. I'm not going to touch, I guess, on this, but surveys have indicated that folks find the benefit in terms of the savings and value, simplicity of the system, as I was kind of saying, the easiness of the system installation. Again, there's no installation on your site, so you're able to avoid some of that difficulty there. So, you know, with that said, let's briefly talk about how it works, and then we'll get into more specifics for policies and programs and as they relate to the state of Maryland. But how it works here is pretty simple. I mean, the energy is generated, electricity is generated on the panels that goes through a meter. The utility provider can meter how much electricity has been being generated from the system, and they can start to credit that out, apportion that out to their those people that they're servicing. So really anybody that's tied to that utility grid can participate in this, whether it's a residential or a business owner or anything in between can participate in this. And based on how much electricity comes out of that PV system, that gets apportioned out and written off on the bill. And we'll look at some examples and billing statements on how that works. So that's a general synopsis, but let's look at, shift gears here and look at some of those programs and see how they tie in with Maryland. So projects are available across the country. You'll see concentrations in certain states like Minnesota, New Hampshire, Colorado. A lot of this has to do with the policies they have in place. There's a number of other factors related to retail electricity rates and other things, but primarily there's a lot of policies and programs in place to support that. You can have utility provided programs as well as third party owned and a number of other options. We'll kind of get into that later, but I just kind of want to highlight some differences in the policies from a general standpoint before we get the specifics. But if you look at the bar graph that is on the right-hand side, you'll see Minnesota is by far leading in capacity generation. I mean, this data goes back to 2017. It's grown significantly. Maryland has as well with our pilot program. But if you look at Minnesota, you'll see this data point here represents that if you follow that across, about 10% of their subscribers are residential. And so they've really prioritized those larger scale installations, which you're typically going to see with the commercial and other farm businesses and everything taking advantage of that. So about 90% of the subscribers in Minnesota are commercial, government, and other organizations, nonprofits as well. If you look at Maryland, Maryland's got about 40%, and like I said, this is not absolutely current. This is back 3 years ago, and a lot happens in 3 years. But 40% is residential in Maryland. So we've got a big chunk of that as well in the other sectors, government, nonprofit, and private. But it really depends on the policies that are in place. Policies, states in dark blue, and maybe I shouldn't have picked blue. You guys might be tired of looking at blue maps. At least they don't have blue and red together to bring back memories of last week. But look at this map here, and you can see the blue states here are those that have policy enacted. You see a lot of that on the Western coast, Northeast, and Maryland as well has that policy in place, and we'll talk about that program. It started, our Maryland program started in 2015, what was signed into action and was launched in 2017. A number of other states since then have done that as well, and we weren't the first state, but a lot of states have those policies in place and other incentives. Like I said, it could be the shared solar or community solar could be implemented either by a utility provider, and you'll see that is much more widespread, offered by the utility. And I'm not going to say utility is all bad, but you're typically getting, with a third-party owned system, you're typically getting more competition, which could work out in your favor, that you have businesses vying for your business. And you know, the utility owned doesn't give you a whole lot of options, and so you're kind of stuck with what they're doing. Now with the third-party owned system, and we'll talk about the opportunities in Maryland specifically, but typically you'll get a better opportunity. You can compare different programs together, and I'll share some tools to do that. Some of the specific policies in place that I'll touch on is virtual net metering. That's one of the biggest ones that you'll hear about. We've talked about net metering a number of times throughout the webinar series. But essentially how that net metering works is your meter is tied to the grid. In a traditional net metering case, if you're generating PV on your rooftop or ground mounted system, your meter reads that, and any excess energy goes on to the utility grid, and you'll be credited for that. Energy can flow both ways, and at the end of the month or the end of the year, your utility provider, if it's BG&E or Pepco, they'll credit you for that amount. Virtual net metering works the same way. The only difference is, as it applies to shared solar, remember this, it's off-site, and so you don't have to have it behind the meter. That PV system could be anywhere in your area, and that amount gets credited back to you. There's group billing and joint ownership as well. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I mean, group billing is kind of similar to how, a landlord for multi-housing unit would receive, the bill for one meter and distribute that to all the tenants. That same kind of concept applies here. Now, we're not going to have time to go into the specifics on each and every policy, but I'll just mention the final one here, joint ownership. Being able to piggyback, so to speak, onto larger projects and benefit from having the economy of scale. So if you're looking at maybe only investing in a small PV system, but you can combine resources there. So there's some of the policies in place in various states that have seen that driven forward. Maryland is one of those. If you want to get more specific details on some of the different factors that contribute to this, you can go to the Shared Renewable Scorecard. The website's there, sharedrenewablesscorecard.org. I pulled up the example here, score sheet for Maryland, and it kind of gives you some more information on policies and state programs. And I'll touch on some of those now. Just as a comparison, I've included this table just to see overall system capacity. So you can't build a system or have a system participating in shared solar that exceeds 2 megawatts, and we've talked about that. That starts getting into the utility scale, and you have to apply with the CPCN, with the Public Service Commission, and go through specific things for generating facilities. So there is a cap on, and we'll look at the specifics in more detail momentarily, but that's the system size. Each system cannot exceed that, and then the overall capacity for all systems in the state is, through this pilot program, is almost 200 megawatts. So it's pretty large systems that you can get, but it's not necessarily talking about utility scale systems. So just to give you an overview, there's 3 different carve outs in Maryland. There's the small brownfield and other category. So these are the smaller scale systems that are under 500 kilowatts. There's the open use. So all other applications would fall under this category. And this is the category that you can go up to 2 megawatts would be the only size restriction on that. Now there's no minimum, but again, the kind of scale works to a larger system, more subscribers, more energy production would be beneficial. And then there's a third carve out, is the low and moderate income category. And that's 30% of the market or the program. And they specify that 10% of that should come from low income subscribers. And so there are some stipulations there. There can be overlap between these. If you have a small system installed or a larger system on a brownfield, or a low and moderate income installed on a brownfield, it would be kind of overlapped. But that's a general layout and different carve outs for those systems. And again, just the timeline, this was a 3-year pilot that started in 2017. In 2019, it was extended to 7 years. So the program will wrap up in 2024. And I'm not sure exactly what the future is. I doubt that, community solar will kind of taper off after that. I think probably see a lot more advancement in that. And we'll kind of look at some of the trends here. Yeah, good. I have some information next. So if you kind of look at the capacity over time, this table goes back to 2010 up until the first quarter of 2018. We've seen capacity grow. Again, these darker regions on the chart are indicating those states, Minneapolis and Massachusetts and other states that have been really heavily involved in the policy side. But we see a lot of growth, and by a lot of projections, community solar is expected to continue growing. So again, I don't necessarily think that just this pilot program, I don't think that when this pilot program is over, this will end. It's a very valuable opportunity for many to get involved in it. So it'll likely continue expanding. By 2030, and that's when our RPS goal is set for 50%. But we're going to see 56.7 gigawatts on a conservative estimate coming from shared solar or community solar. Again, just the pie chart on the right-hand side just indicates the leading states, Minnesota being number 1, 25% of all shared solar is coming out of Minnesota. And I think this data is from earlier this summer. And so you can kind of get an idea there. Now, Maryland has some installed, obviously, and we'll look at some of the specific programs in Maryland as well, but we're not necessarily competing with some of those leading states. I do also want to talk about the economics. We've talked a number of times, and specifically last week looked a lot at the economics and financing of the systems, but I do want to draw attention to the levelized cost of community or shared solar. It's very comparable to conventional energy resources. Again, the larger the system is, the better rate you're going to get in terms of the per kilowatt hour or per kilowatt. And so we do see a much more comparability here. Again, the levelized cost kind of takes into account the maintenance and operation of the system. And so that is big savings for any renewable, especially PV, because very little maintenance and operation costs. The fuel, in this case, sunlight, is free. And so that helps the cost be driven down for any PV technology. And of course, then serving so many different subscribers, you're getting a benefit there as well in terms of the size of a shared solar PV system. So to look at what we have to pay, I think it will be beneficial to look at an example bill. So here's a bill from Pepco, and we'll kind of look at what your typical utility bill looks like. And there's a number of charges on there. We'll kind of briefly highlight what these are. So first thing I'll point out is you get this amount of energy that you use each month. And so that'll be one thing included on your bill. In this example, it's not much energy. It's a 529 kilowatt hours of energy being used through that month. And now when we look at what we're actually being billed for, first thing I'll point out is there's a charge here, what's called on the Pepco bill, a customer charge. It may be called something else on BG&E and Delmarva and others, but here it's called a customer charge. This is a fixed cost, and so you're not going to get rid of this. It's not based on the amount of energy you use. You really can't escape from that. But when we start looking at all these different charges, these electricity charges, and these are all delivery charges here on the bottom of this first page, these are all based on how many kilowatt hours you use. And so you take your energy, well, you don't have to do this because they already do it on your bill, but this is how they calculate it. They take your 529 kilowatt hours and they multiply it by all these delivery charges. And so your delivery charges in total will be about $25. And that's only half of the picture. The other half of your picture is the supply charges. And so they do the same thing. They have an energy charge and a couple other fees here, procurement costs. These rates also get multiplied by how much energy you use. So the more energy you use, it drives both the delivery as well as the supply charges up. So for the supply, you have almost $42. So it's a combination of all these prices that add up to the total, in this case, is $67. Pretty cheap utility bill, but just for an example, this works. So based on the customer charge, your delivery, and your supply charges, your total bill is $67, and that's typically what you pay every month. You pay your utility provider for that energy that you used and the customer charges and everything else. Now, as I said, there's nothing you can really do about the customer charge. You're always going to be charged these flat rate fees, even with shared solar. But how this works, if we take that customer charge out of the equation, let's take whatever we owe for our bill and subtract that customer charge, we're really paying for the energy that we're using. We're paying $59.44. Okay. And so if we get that on a per kilowatt hour basis, just basically all this information to share with you that we're trying to take out those flat rate fees that we're being charged, in this case, the customer charge, and find out what that is on a per kilowatt hour basis. In this case, it's about 11 cents per kilowatt hour without that customer charge factored into the equation. And so this is really the impact that you're going to have on your utility bill is being able to get under that amount. And so oftentimes quotes work or programs work in different ways. Subscriptions could be based on a fixed or commonly based on an escalation of what's going to happen to energy prices. But they may also come in the form of, we're going to give you 5% less than the utility rate that you have. So, if they're going to give me 5 or 10% less, then I'll need to know what this number is. And this needs to be, again, factored in apart from that fixed customer charge. That doesn't really play in the picture here. So we're looking at this per kilowatt hour basis of energy cost. And that's often how we're going to compare different programming opportunities. So it commonly works where you get 2 bills. There are 1 billing systems in place, and we'll talk about some of those if we have time, but typically you'll get 2 bills. So, right now we kind of went through an example of a standard Pepco bill, which would be one one bill that you get from Pepco. But with most programs, you're going to have your essentially two energy providers. You're going to have your standard utility bill. An example I was just using, it was Pepco. But you're also going to have the bill from your solar provider as well. And so, these two bills kind of go hand in hand, and you should be able to match them up month by month and see how it kind of works out based on the credits you get from the subscription. So if you look at the provider bill here, the solar credits you get are $50, and they're giving you, I think, a discount here. So they're giving you a 20% discount. I don't think we're going to get nearly that in Maryland. This is another state using their example here. But you'll typically get some discount, and we'll talk about what those are, some of those options here in Maryland. So your total bill for your solar provider is going to be $40. And so you're going to owe that $40 to the solar provider. Now, when you get credited on your main utility bill, again, you're not going to hit the customer charge and all that, but you're going to receive a per kilowatt hour basis. So it's how many kilowatt hours are going to get carried over. In this case, it's based on your utility rate, your cost per kilowatt hour. So in this example, it's 7 cents per kilowatt hour. We see those rates around Baltimore and other areas of the state. But it's per kilowatt hour came out. 714 kilowatt hours were produced from the solar system. And so you're credited that amount. And so that gets written off. And so you're paying for the difference in that bill. And so really what this adds up to, you take your total for your electric bill, take your total for your solar bill. And so in the month between those two bills, you're paying $99. And so there is some savings depending on what kind of subscription you join. So there's a tool here at the Clean Energy Resources team. They have some tools on their website that you might want to look into, different pricing structures, particularly if you're looking at subscription. We'll also talk, before we close out this afternoon, look at how you can develop your own solar subscription or solar project as well. But they have some tools on there where you can kind of put different factors in. They have where you can, and this is coming out of Minnesota, this example, but you can use some tools there and put in the escalation rate and other things for the energy to see if it makes sense for you to subscribe to programs. But again, it's going to be based on, program by program basis. It's really going to make a difference on what you're looking at. So here's another example of a Pepco bill. Again, you'll see in this example here, and this is with a Neighborhood Sun program, you're being credited $133. And so, you should be able to see where those factors get come into play. So again, you can review this, some of this information and the resources I've linked here as well. I've got a link there to the Neighborhood Sun, and they have a number of good resources on their website. I briefly want to mention other grant opportunities through Maryland Energy Administration. We talked about some of the PV for, installing a system last week, and they have some residential and battery storage options. But specifically today, I'll just mention these community solar grant incentives. So they have low and moderate income and also business category, depending on what you're looking at, $100 to $300 per kilowatt. And so those are some good incentives there in the state as well that factor into that picture. But we'll start to explore briefly with the time we have left. I see some questions, and I'll address those momentarily. But I want to talk about different ways that we can participate in a shared solar system. On one end of the extreme, you can just be a subscriber, and we've talked about that to some extent so far. You could also take a more active role in developing new programs, serving as a host site or as a subscriber organization, and kind of building a collective group, maybe neighborhood citizens, or it could be community members in any capacity, and forming an LLC or something like that to see a system get off the ground and start a new system. So there's all different levels you can get involved in. What I will say from a subscription standpoint, straight up, you can just go to, this is a great website for finding out about programs in the state of Maryland, and they have a number of other states on there as well. But this is Solar United Neighbors. You can go to their website, solarunitedneighbors.org. I'll post these slides up so you can click the link later as well. But if you go to their website, you can select your state. I selected Maryland, PEPCO region. I'm just sticking with that example. You can put in how much energy you use on a monthly basis, and it will give you some programs output here and different programs available in your area. And so this will help you kind of look into, some of them are going to have credit rating requirements and other things like that. If it's low income, accessible, it generally indicates that, and that's not going to have the credit score issues. But there's a lot of options on there to find out about existing community solar programs. A number of factors to consider as you're looking into subscriptions. Again, this could be capacity based. So per size of the system, you might buy into the panels up front or do some kind of financing to have the panels, and that would be on the capacity or the kilowatt base. And if you remember, that kilowatt is a unit of energy. The other way that comes, and I've mentioned this previously, is per energy or per kilowatt hour of the production of system. This is more common. I see this a lot more. Most programs seem to be operating in this way. And there are a hybrid and combination of those as well. I've also mentioned that payment type comes in a variety of forms. It could be fixed or escalating amount based on the rising prices, but it could also be percent below whatever your utility rate is. Again, we took that customer charge out in that PEPCO example, but that they would say, you know, in this standard example here, 5 to 10% discount compared to what you're paying on your utility bill. That's pretty common. And again, mostly you're going to see the two billing systems. There are systems where you're with the utility where you're only going to have one bill and other examples. But those are some of the pieces that you'll want to kind of factor into the puzzle as you consider that. You know, just some questions here. I'm not going to take time because I know I'm low on time here. But typically, you know, you go through the process here. You're going to start making payments. Once you subscribe, you're going to make payments to the solar provider. You're going to get your bill that's been credited with that solar amount and pay your utility bill. So you'll have those two bills. I do want to talk about different ownership models as we kind of end off and pivot into more of the program development. As I said, you can take a more active role than just subscribing. Three primary ownership models I'll talk about is utility. And I'll add that this is very similar to a third-party owned system, so I've kind of lumped that together. So either a utility or third-party owned system here. And if you're just wanting to subscribe, this is probably what you're going to do is you're going to subscribe to a utility owned or third-party owned system. There's also the SPE or special purpose entity. I think I mentioned that previously. Or the system could be owned by a nonprofit charitable organization. And I'll give a few brief examples of each of those just to give you some ideas on possibilities for this as we kind of see a lot of opportunities open up in the future, particularly for farmers and other business owners to take advantage of this. So that utility owned model, you as a subscriber don't own the system, it's owned by the utility. And you know, there's a lot of common examples of this. There's this utility example I've included here in Seattle, Washington, and it's a 62 kilowatt system. Between the subscribers are neighborhood associations, a zoo, and some other government buildings, I believe. But the idea here is that it's owned by, in this example, it's a utility, or I would say this is very similar to a third-party owned system. But I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the special purpose entity. And this is where we can kind of get creative and develop a a business enterprise or an LLC or something like that, where we bring a group of individuals or business owners together to implement a project and oversee some of that project. And so in this case, you're more of a owner of the system than that other model, and you have more decision-making ability in this. And this example here in College Park, a church there, you know, and the economics included here, they were able to take advantage of the federal tax credit back when it's 30%. And this was some years ago that they installed this. I forget the exact date, but this was a while back. But they had the 30% tax credit. They also had that depreciation, the maker's depreciation over the 6-year period, where they saved quite a bit on that. And again, this was a church organization that structured themselves. I'm not sure exactly how it played out, but they structured themselves as some business entity to take advantage of that. So there's options from that avenue as well, and then the nonprofit as well, where a nonprofit administers the project on behalf of donors. So that adds a donor into the picture, where they're typically, the donors are not going to be subscribers themselves, although I suppose they could be. But there's an example here, again, an example from Washington State of a school system that had this installed. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be modeled. I don't have time to get into more details. This is just another way of looking at those systems. So utility and developer owned are very similar, as I mentioned. You might have some difference here with a developer owned system if there's a subscriber management organization there, an SMO. But again, you can get pretty creative with these and how you structure these. And this is an example, again, of that special purpose entity. So I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but I'll just say, you know, depending on how involved you want to get, there's a lot of aspects that are entailed in this. But if you wanted to develop a new program or project, you know, one of the things is you'll need to organize a subscriber base. And so that's a pretty easy concept if you can gather a group of people and have them collaborate on this idea and agree to develop a project, or at least a request for proposals or something like that. This could be a neighborhood association or other business owners in the area. It could be pretty diverse, but that does take some effort. Identifying a good host site acquisition is important as well. And your property might be an option if you have that space available. But that's another way to serve in a shared solar program, or identifying any host sites. And so we've talked about some of these previously, how to develop a site. We've touched on that. Next week, we'll look at larger scale, utility scale, and how we develop a site and some of the key site requirements that we'll be looking at. So we've kind of touched on these topics before, but these are also a unique aspect as you're getting involved in an actual system. Permitting contracts, then you get a little bit more involved in working on the financing, construction, permitting, and all that, electrical, zoning, and all that, and being able to navigate some of that. And then identifying and serving potentially as a project sponsor, that would take another level of requirement. So these are all different ways that you can get involved. And if you're really ambitious, you could work in all these areas and kind of see the project through. I'll just make a comment on how this typically takes place. Is you're going to develop a RFP, or request for proposal, from developers to implement a system. It could be an RFI, a request for information, and that's often kind of a precursor. If you don't even have all of the information, or you don't even know the questions to be asking, you can start at that stage. But regardless, you're going to need a number of information, and there's just some common recommendations here. Clearly align your goals and make sure all the stakeholders are involved in that process and early on. You probably want to hire a consultant to handle some of the technical, legal, and policy and permitting issues in developing an RFP. And I'll include some resources at the end where you can kind of see some examples. Determine what kind of ownership system you're going to want. We talked about the SPE. We talked about you're not going to have a utility-owned system, but you're going to have some of those other, maybe it's a nonprofit, maybe you develop an LLC or something like that, and some questions to ask here as you consider that. Consider the site. You have good available space, it's free from shade and those kind of things. Local siting and permitting are important as well, and you'll kind of have to cast that in any really specific details into the RFP so that the developers can address those when they respond to it. And then go through the review process and start to navigate the responses that you get on that RFP. So again, a lot of information that you can get from our RFP. Here's some of the elements that many of these are topics that a developer would respond to. And you'll kind of wade through all those responses and decide who really addressed the questions and hit our goals and is giving us good information on this. And they'll include all the financial aspects, the site information, permitting, the technical aspects are important as well. These are things we've talked about previously when we talked about signing a contract with a developer or an installer. What's included in their bid, and this is much in the same way. What kind of equipment are they using, the modules and the inverters and all those aspects as well. And giving you a timeline of how long this process will take place, starting with permitting, going through the installation. So you get a lot of information by developing an RFP, and that's kind of the initial stages of program or project development. So I've included a number of resources here. Again, this information will be posted on the Maryland Energy Extension website. As I get the questions, I'm going to pull up our next survey. And while you're addressing those questions on the poll that I've just launched, I'll check the questions, and please continue to chime in with any further questions that you have. And of course, you can reach out to me separately as well. As you're answering these questions, I'll just kind of mention upcoming programs in this webinar series. We've got 2 left. Okay, so we have next week, we'll be dealing with utility scale leasing issues. We've got a number of interesting topics on the docket for that. And then we also have our final session. We'll take a little break for Thanksgiving on that week, but we'll come back in December with a final session on battery storage and looking how we couple a solar PV system with battery storage, whether it's off-grid or on-grid, grid-tied. There's a lot of options out there for different battery systems. So we'll get on that. If you haven't registered for those programs, please go to the Maryland Energy Extension webpage and do that.